I came across Robert's life because it was part of a research into the voices of working class radicalism in London and Gloucestershire and the links between Gloucestershire and London. And I was very interested in the life of Alan Davenport, who was a Chartist who died in the 1840s. And Alan was a poet and a radical and a follower of Thomas Spence. So the life of Alan Davenport took me to the life of Thomas Spence, the agrarian communist of the late 18th, early 19th century, and the life of Thomas Spence took me to the life of Robert Wedderburn. And what particularly captivated me about the life of Mr. Wedderburn was that he had made his way from the West Indies to London, made his way from being a jack tar to being a tailor down there by Soho, made his way to Soho through teaching himself essentially to read and write and communicate, and teaching himself to be an extemporizing orator as well, who could speak vivaciously without notes. And he was a working class leader of colour, and nobody within the working class radical sections of society in London commented on the fact that he was a person of colour. It quite obviously didn't matter. The only pejorative and what we would now call racist comments would come from the pen or the eyes of the middle class and upper class observers who would go sometimes to the chapels that he ran in Hopkins Street around Soho. So mesmerising was I by the life of Mr. Spence and Mr. Wedderburn that 2 years ago, on Thomas Spence's birthday, Midsummer's Day, we went on a pilgrimage around the streets where Thomas Spence would have chalked his slogans. Spence would chalk radical and revolutionary slogans on the pavements. No landlords, you fools. The people's farm. No war. No pit. No king. And so Robert Wedderburn was a revolutionary in a domestic sense, in an English and British setting. He was a Republican. He was a radical. He spoke against the action of the yeomanry at Peterloo. He was imprisoned for his beliefs. He was an evangelizing preacher who managed to fuse together secular radicalism with an evangelical perspective on spirituality. But he also connected the domestic policies of this and politics of this country with an international sphere. He was an abolitionist, a slavery abolitionist. So when he was in prison, he was visited by Wilberforce, and I think William Wilberforce was just hung his head in the hearing the passion and the oratory of Mr. Wedderburn. He died in 1835 to 36, we're not quite sure. I think the registration of births, marriages and deaths came along in 1836, so he died before we would have that actual authentication. Born, I think, in 1762. So his life straddled that period where, if you like, Britain did rule the waves, but Britain also relentlessly pursued trade in slavery, that triangular trade down the road at Bristol, of course. And then the abolition of the slave trade in 1807, and then the abolition of slavery in 1833 to 34. But of course, it's only in 2015 that taxpayers stopped paying the interest on the vast sum of money that was paid to the owners of slaves in 1834. Something like £17 billion in today's money as compensation to people who own slaves. So this litany of inequality and injustice which I've just talked about, Mr. Wedderburn was there confronting it, having taught himself to communicate through a quill and to be an extemporizing radical speaker. And so I think his life is an exemplar for people today in terms of confronting injustice and inequality, particularly in the context of Black Lives Matter and where we stand in this year of our Lord 2020. He wasn't alone, of course. William Davidson was also a man of colour. This progeny, the consequence of a liaison between a plantation owner and a slave. So as with Mr. Wedderburn, how consensual was that sexual relationship? So Wedderburn's, even his birth and his provenance is based upon racial and gender exploitation. William Davidson, again a working class leader in London, executed in 1820 for his role in the Cato Street conspiracy. And then I could speak of William Cuffay. William, what a life he led. He was a Chartist. I mentioned them early on, a working class political movement to gain votes for ordinary people. And William was a London radical. He looked after the funds of the Chartist movement. He straddled that division between moral force Chartists who believed that the working class had to show themselves worthy and responsible for having the vote, and the other side, the physical force Chartists, who thought the only way to get the vote would be through revolution or a show of force and resolve. He straddled that divide. He was transported. The evidence suggests that he was possibly set up by agent provocateur, but he was transported to Tasmania from London. And again, a working class leader of colour, but nobody within the working classes were bothered about that at all. There's no pejorative comment about colour or any comment about colour, only from the pen of the upper classes and middle classes, journalists and so on. And the judge. Racial terms from them. But William transported to Tasmania, and he carried on the struggle. He carried on campaigning for rights for convicts and released convicts, and to the end of his days he fought for equality. And his wife got a ticket of leave and joined him out there in Tasmania. I think he died in about 1870. So there we have a backcloth of working class leadership from people of colour in the late 18th and early 19th century, showing us that there's been a visible black presence within our country, within our politics and within our society that stretches so far back. And those are the reasons why I've become interested in the life of Mr. Wedderburn, Mr. Davidson and indeed Mr. Cuffay.